I tend to call this lecture corrections because that's what textbooks do, but actually it's a tremendously bad term because we do very little in the way of correcting. And hopefully that's somewhat clear given what we've said about the decline in the emphasis on rehabilitation. However, we do need to know what we do when we at least say we're correcting. The first thing to say about that is when we talk about corrections, we are talking about a few primary institutions. The one we're most familiar with is prison. And about 2 million people are in prison on an annual basis in the United States. The second one is jails. In terms of jail serves two purposes. Jail is there to hold people while they are awaiting trial. And it is also there to hold people while they are sentenced, usually on misdemeanors, for sentences of less than a year. Researchers and scholars have recently estimated that something like 13 million people are admitted into jail in a given year. That's a huge number of people. Now, some of those people are going to be a mentally ill or homeless person who keeps on going into jail because we don't have adequate mental health facilities in place, and they should rather be serviced by the mental health system. Some of these people will be people who are serious criminals and never get out again. Some of those people will be entirely innocent and they will not be sentenced at all. So it's really a very mixed bag. In terms of the number of people who are in the community portion of the prison system, there we're talking about 5 million a year. So as we've seen, most sentences do not result in incarceration. And the most important kind of sentence in the community is a sentence of probation. Now, if you were in my class, I would make you channel your inner 5-year-old, and maybe sitting at your desk or wherever you are now, you can channel your inner 5-year-old and repeat after me. Probation is a sentence. Yep, probation is a sentence. And that's really important because it's so easy to think if it's not prison or if it's not jail, it's not a sentence. So why are people put into the community? Well, there are lots of reasons. In general, we use the community correction system when we're at our best moments in order to build upon the recognition that offenders who have greater relationships with their families, employment, or other normal sources of life are less likely to reoffend. We also, at least in theory, have a great belief in liberty, so we want to find the least restrictive alternative, especially when public safety is not at risk. In that regard, the idea of community corrections is that we only want to punish people as severely as is necessary for public safety as well as to satisfy the public mind. As we've seen, however, recently that public mind has been pushing us in a more punitive direction in the 80s and 90s, and the real question is where we're going in the future. Last but certainly not least, the community correction system is much cheaper than putting people in jail and prison, which tends to be very expensive. When judges sentence people to community corrections, they are making certain assumptions. They tend to say that either the crime or the person's background record is not serious enough to deserve or need incarceration. They do take costs into account. They do want to avoid recidivism, which tends to be higher for people who do go to prison. And they know that community ties help prevent people reoffending. Now, we've already mentioned the idea of probation, which, as I said, is a sentence and is the most widely used sentence in community sanctions. However, probation can be used alone or in combination with other sanctions. So, for example, you might use probation with house arrest or with substance abuse treatment or with restitution, or with fines. You'll also sometimes hear the term intermediate sanctions, and these are defined differently in different systems, but really it's another way of saying community corrections, corrections based in the community that might be less restrictive or more restrictive. Now, that sentence of probation means that what is actually happening is the court is conditionally releasing an offender into the community under the supervision of a probation officer in most cases, sometimes other correctional officials, usually with court-identified rules or provisions and requirements. So, in getting that sentence of probation, essentially a person's being told, if you obey all these rules, you need not go to jail or prison. Those rules can be minimal or they can be pretty demanding. There might be things like urine testing to make sure a person isn't using drugs. They might involve a person having to get a job or try and get a job or go to school or go to parenting classes or go to anger management classes or pay restitution. Generally, people in probation do have lower levels of recidivism than people who go to prison. However, a lot of whether recidivism is higher or lower depends on the kind of crime the person committed in the first place. One of the biggest problems with probation is it tends to be most effective when it has a lot of resources to support offenders remaking their lives and rehabilitating themselves and keeping themselves out of trouble. So it needs both the carrot of incentives to change and ways to change, like going to school, for example, or getting job training, for example. And it also needs the stick, the police officer or the probation officer making sure the person follows the rules, because if they were good at following the rules, they wouldn't be on probation in the first place. Typically, the higher the levels of supervision and treatment, the more successful it is. For that reason, there's a particular kind of probation that's developed called intensive supervision probation, where probation is granted under conditions of strict reporting to a probation officer who has a much more limited caseload. Because one of the problems probation officers face is that they have very large caseloads in most cases. And that's a problem because they can't do as good of a job. We need to distinguish probation from parole. I suggested you channel your inner 5-year-old and say, probation is a sentence. Well, do that again and say, parole is part of a sentence. Parole is part of a sentence where offenders are conditionally released from prison under strict conditions and remain under state custody. In the situation of parole, a person is let out of prison while their sentence is still ongoing under the requirement they do or don't do certain things. Again, they might have to look for a job. They might have to live in a halfway house. They might be prohibited from using alcohol. This usually happens towards the end of a prison term, and unfortunately, in my opinion, and the opinion of most experts in the criminal justice universe, we have curtailed parole when it tends to be a pretty useful tool to encourage people to behave well in prison and to make a real attempt to reintegrate into the community upon release. To the extent that we use parole, we have seen a trend over the last 2 or so decades of making it much easier for people to be sent back to prison while they're on parole. Now, the first kind of way a person can be sent back to prison because they're on parole would make sense to most of us, and that's if they commit a new crime. Of course, if somebody commits a new crime while on parole, most of us would expect them to be sent back to prison. But there's another category of violation which has led hundreds, in some cases thousands or tens of thousands in other cases, of people to be sent back to prison while on parole. And these are called technical violations. This is when a person doesn't break a criminal law, but breaks one of the rules of their parole. For example, coming back home late and violating curfew, or drinking alcohol when they weren't allowed to drink alcohol. And these types of technical violations also result in people returning to prison. On the happier side of the story, parole does end successfully if the parolee complies with the conditions. We have seen a decrease of parole in the last few decades, and perhaps we'll see a return of parole because many criminal justice experts believe that it is a useful tool to prevent crime and reform criminals. As I alluded to a little while ago, in practice, jails have become a de facto way that we deal with mentally ill people in society because of a well-intentioned phenomenon called deinstitutionalization that occurred in the 1960s and 70s and 1980s. We rely less and less on psychiatric institutions. However, people who should have been released from psychiatric institutions and been treated in community mental health systems found when they were released from psychiatric institutions that they did not get the supports they needed, and in practice often behaved in ways that were considered nuisance violations, sometimes criminal and sometimes not, to the broader public. So invariably it was the police that had to deal with them, and those people tend to cycle in and out of jails across the United States, seldom getting the kind of mental health treatment, let alone physical health treatment, that they need. So jails are a big problem that need correction, whether it's the fact that some of the people who are in jail shouldn't be there because they could actually be let out on bail if it wasn't so high, or because they would be better served by the mental health system than by the jail system, or by the fact that there isn't enough rehabilitation and treatment in jails, including for people who aren't convicted to short sentences. Nevertheless, invariably it tends to be prison where most of our focuses on corrections come from, and that's not misplaced. Although in terms of the overall correction system, prison contains the smallest number of people, it still contains way more people than it ever has historically if we look at the United States in the context of its own history, or if we look at the United States in the context of the world. Now, when you finish listening to me, you're going to watch a fabulous video John Oliver has made about prisons and about mass incarceration and about some of the issues we face in that. And I'm going to try and contextualize a little bit of some of the issues that he's going to raise. It is hard to emphasize what a unique moment we find ourselves at in the current juncture when we look at what has come to be called mass incarceration. And that is because we have more people in prison than we have ever had, absolutely and proportionately. It's very important to emphasize that when we measure who is in prison, we measure who is in prison as a rate, as a number per 100,000 people. So when we look at this graph that you're seeing, and you see the increase in the number of people in prison, what you are not seeing is a reflection of the increase in population, because those are all measures based on a rate of incarceration. So the rate is stable. What you are seeing is an increase in the number of people who go to prison because we as a society have decided to punish more people for more crimes for a longer period of time, and P.S. send them back to prison if perchance they are able to go on parole but violate under a technical violation. Let's look at this graph a little bit more closely. What you see is from 1925 until about 1975, there's a pretty stable rate of imprisonment in the United States. There's some ups, there's some downs that can be explained by certain factors. But in general, we see that No more than 200,000 people are in US prisons. Suddenly, from the mid-1970s, we start seeing a very big change, and it's a change that just keeps on going and going and going like the Energizer Bunny. And we see more and more and more people being sent to prison from the mid-1970s until today. Now, if you look really carefully in the top corner, you'll see that there does start to be a slight decline in the rate of growth of who's in prison around 2010. Unfortunately, that has already started turning back around again. So we have a very, very, very long way to get anything close to the kind of levels of imprisonment we saw in much of American history. If you look at the next graph, you'll also see that if the United States compares itself to the world, we also have more people in prison proportionately than any other country. Now, in my own opinion, we need to take the rates of incarceration far more seriously when we're comparing ourselves to democratic countries like India, Sweden, Denmark, Germany, France, than undemocratic countries like Rwanda and Russia, as well as China. But nevertheless, whether we compare ourselves to democratic or undemocratic countries, we see that the US simply incarcerates far more people than anywhere else. As the first graph has hopefully hinted at you, there is only a loose relationship between crime itself and prison. It's much more about what we criminalize and what we give as punishments. In fact, there's plenty of research that suggests there is almost no relationship between the current practices of incarceration and public safety. There are some ways our current practice of incarceration have made us safer, but there are other ways in which they have made us less safe, and especially are likely to make us less safe in the future. Let's say a little bit about some other facets of mass incarceration. Firstly, we find that there is a very important and disproportionate racial dimension to it. This is something that has been hinted to you right from the get-go of this class when we had a look at the greater likelihood of African American people to be punished for consuming drugs than white people. And it's a point that John Oliver makes as well. Simply put, prison today has become a civil rights issue in terms of race equality, and not just a civil rights issue in terms of the rights of people who have been convicted about crime. When we look at demographics, though, the issue is not only about race. Another significant demographic issue involves gender, and it involves gender in at least two ways. Firstly, when we look at male prisons, we tend to find that they are hypermasculine environments where the worst features of what it might mean to be male, like being violent and being tough, are emphasized, rather than the best characteristics of what it might mean to be male. On the other hand, we see that although women are still a very small proportion of the number of people in prisons, their rates of inclusion in the prison system have risen very rapidly. When it comes to gender and when it comes to race, a very important factor behind this has been the war on drugs. The war on drugs has really driven a lot, but not all, of this massive increase in incarceration over the last few years. We will have to see whether the fact that we're starting to see some decriminalization or legalization of marijuana, is that helping at all? The minor changes in the crack cocaine sentencing disparity at the federal level, is that helping at all? Time will tell. One thing we can say with a high degree of certainty is that prison really matters. And it matters in all sorts of vital, important ways. Firstly, we need to ask, does it work? Presumably, we wouldn't expend the billions and billions and billions we spend on prisons, on our education system or on our health system or on our road system or on any other element that we invest public monies on, if we didn't have some assurance that we were getting what we wanted out of it. To the extent we want retribution, well, we might be getting that. Deterrence, kind of mixed bag, isn't really going to happen in its own right. It needs rehabilitation and it needs work on re-entry, a topic we'll come to next. To the extent we're talking about rehabilitation, bad news, very bad news. Simply put, as the number of prisoners we have has increased, the spending we have on rehabilitation is decreased. Imagine those as two lines in a graph. People are up, spending is down. And so we are trying to do rehabilitation with less money for more people. And so people are not getting the skills training they need. They are not getting the education they need. They are not getting the treatment they need. They are not getting the contact with families they need. These are really, really, really huge issues. I've mentioned costs a few times, and that's really important. And that's one of the ways the average person can be persuaded to take an interest in prisons, because in the end, anybody who pays tax in the United States, whether it's sales tax, state taxes, federal taxes, it doesn't matter, is helping to pay for prisons. So we want to make sure that we are getting what we want out of it. But costs are not just defined in financial terms, they are also defined in human terms. One of the terms you will encounter is something called collateral consequences. This is a rather fancy term that academics and activists have come up with to talk about the fact that prison does not only affect people who are inside of prison, but it also affects the society on the outside. It affects families of inmates who have done nothing wrong. It affects how we spend limited resources in terms of what we allocate money on. If you have a look at this graphic, you'll see a phenomenon that some people have called million-dollar blocks. The brighter the red color in these images, the more money is being spent. In fact, on a per block basis, at least $1 million is being spent per year on that block on incarcerating somebody or many people within those communities. Here's the rub. The most money is spent in the poorest communities, and it's not the communities that are benefiting. In fact, it's the opposite. The more money that is spent on incarcerating members of the community in faraway prisons, the less money is available on dealing with the health needs, the housing needs, the mental health needs, the educational needs, the family support needs of the people who are living in those blocks. Yet another way prison really matters is, contrary to the way we often set it up in our imagination, is thinking that prison seals us off from the people inside prison. Actually, there's a tremendous dynamism between what happens inside prison and outside of prison. The easiest way to imagine that for most of us is criminal gangs, because what happens with criminal gangs is very often prison gangs are a way to increase the recruitment of new members in prison, to train members of a gang who had a limited understanding of crime in a more sophisticated understanding of crime. Sometimes prisons are called universities of crime, and for good reason. By the way, this is not just an issue within the United States. This is an issue on the global stage. One of the chief recruiting devices that terrorist organizations use around the world are, in fact, prisons. A noted scholar of Al-Qaeda has defined the prisons of Egypt, for example, as being one source of the roots of 9/11. if we turn those ideas the other way around, not just how does prison potentially harm us in a bad way because we can't seal ourselves off from it, because gang members are going to go inside and out, because family members who are innocent are going to be hurt. We can also look at how prison affects us in another way in terms of our values. The United States was a country that was built on an emphasis on liberty. Prison, by definition, takes away liberty. And in many cases, that is the correct thing, what we need to prevent ourselves from people who violate things that hurt all of our citizenship, by threatening our safety, by stealing our property. But what happens when they get out of prison? And here we see some clashes between ideals of democracy and ideals of a second chance and ideals of new beginnings with the way we actually run our prison system. Because in practice, when people leave prison, we tend to make it extraordinarily difficult for them to regain full citizenship, both in a metaphoric sense and in a literal sense. In a literal sense, many people who have finished their sentences and have paid their debt to society are nevertheless still denied the opportunity to vote, for example. By the way, the origins of that come from directly after the Civil War, when legislators in the South wanted to stop former slaves from voting. So there were conscious, stated, explicit racial reasons for that initial disenfranchisement of people with criminal convictions. But in less direct meanings of citizenship, in more metaphorical meanings of citizenship, we deny people the opportunity in terms of leaving prison from full engagement in our society. So, for example, with many drug crimes, you can't get a student loan to go to college, or you can't live in public housing. So there are all sorts of ways in which prison really matters to our society. Because I do research on prisons, I really like talking about prisons, but after I saw the John Oliver video you're going to watch, I decided nobody can do a better job than he can in pointing out some of the fundamental issues that have shaped our environment in prison and shape our environment out of prison and how they interact together. Most of us are pretty interested about what happens in prison. That's why TV shows like Oz or Orange is the New Black, at least in part, are so successful. We're really curious about life in prison. However, some of those shows, especially something like Oz, give us a very distorted idea of prison life. The first thing to be said about life in prison is there's tremendous variation. Some prisons are very well run, some are very badly run. Some are awash in illegal drugs. Some are very strict and don't allow contraband. Some, very few, have good rehabilitation programs that are widely available. Most have either poor quality rehabilitation programs or insufficient rehabilitation programs to meet the needs of people. Some prisons are very much defined by the gang culture. Others are not. In some prisons, particularly in California, the prison authorities actually segregate people on a basis on race. All prisons are defined in gendered ways. In other words, we have male prisons versus female prisons. Overall, it is typically understood that juveniles shouldn't go to prison, but in fact they do sometimes go to adult prisons, and that is allowed in some states, in some circumstances. Some prisons are extremely violent and extremely dangerous. All prisons, however, arguably have a threat of violence, and there's a difference. It might not affect the immediate stress level. In other words, fearing violence all the time is probably as stressful as actually living with violence. But there is a distinction between the threat of violence and the reality of violence. What might surprise most of us is actually For many people, the worst part about prison life is the relentless boredom. Most people in prison have nothing to do or almost nothing to do and all day to do it. Most people in prison would love to be able to work. If you've watched Orange is the New Black, you'll see that kitchen duty is one of the most prized achievements in the prison. Partly because sometimes you've got access to better food and sometimes you can smuggle. But it's not only about that. It's also about the fact you've got something productive to do. And most human beings crave having something productive to do. And most people in prison don't have anything productive to do. So boredom is a huge issue, and bored people behave badly, especially bored people who have a prior history of all sorts of mental health problems, drug problems, family problems, life in poverty, and so on. They are not predisposed in most cases to suddenly find a new path in prison. Some people do, and that's very interesting, and arguably researchers could do a lot more by looking at the example of people who do turn their lives around and see what about them could give us lessons for other people. Is it something in the individual, or are there patterns at stake? That's the kind of thing penologists, criminologists, and so on do in their research. Overall, however, life in prison is long, bleak, boring, and fearful. It also tends to be very difficult for correctional officers who work in prisons. Some correctional officers are abusive and corrupt. Most are not, but they still deal with the stresses and the fears and the tensions of prison, and it tends to be a very difficult job. I do want to deal with one common misconception. Many people have heard about private prisons and consider private prisons, and a term that's often associated with them, the prison industrial complex, to be the chief problem associated with mass incarceration. Arguably, that's not true. As John Oliver points out, there are actually relatively few private prisons. However, there are many companies that make their money from feeding off prisons more generally. So even in a federal or state prison, for example, the uniforms are probably going to be provided by a private vendor. Often the food and security or elements of the security are provided by private vendors. The prisons themselves might be built by private vendors. So there are enormous actual and potential financial interests in maintaining what is called the prison industrial complex, even aside from private prisons. So private prisons are an issue, and there is a big debate as to whether they are a good or bad public policy. But they are certainly not the only part of the prison industrial complex. If anything, they are the smallest part of the prison industrial complex.